Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horn. I am absolutely delighted to have in today's virtual studio Martin Goldberg, I think also known as Marty Goldberg, but let me introduce him professionally as Martin Goldberg. And I'm just going to say a few words about Marty, and you'll find more information in the show notes for today's episode and all the links to get in touch with Marty and to purchase his new book, Out of the Workplace Trap, A Theory and Therapy of Organizations Based on the Work of Wilhelm Reich. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. But again, you'll find it in the show notes. Marty's been a leader in the field of organization development for over 35 years. For many years, he served as a partner and practice leader in change solutions for a major global consulting firm, and he has been in private practice since 2010. He has written and published widely on organization development theory and practice, and he serves on the editorial board for the Organization Development Review. Side by side, his graduate studies at Pepperdine University's pioneering Masters of Science in Organization Development program. He trained as a social scientist in Reich's clinical modality with its College of Psychiatrists in Princeton, the American College of Ergonomy, to apply it to the organizational world. Today, he focuses on research, writing, practitioner development, teaching organization dynamics, including a yearly organization behavior seminar at Pepperdine. He did his own undergraduate work at UCLA and Reed College. He lives in Eastern Maryland, which is near the Chesapeake Bay. So again, I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Marty, and I'm really looking forward to learning and discussing more about Out of the Workplace Trap. So Marty, that's all about you. Why don't you say a few words to introduce yourself?
Well, you did a lovely job with that, Mike, and so I appreciate that. I've been at it for quite a while, and the work itself was a redo, as it were, of what my graduate thesis was 30 years ago, over 30 years ago. And I wanted to come back to that after many, many years of practice and see how that what that did to iterate or change what my theoretical notions were, a theory of organization, what is an organization, and a theory of practice of how and where and when we intervene for most effect.
Well, that's an interesting question. Why don't we just start there? I always wanted to talk about Wilhelm Reich, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But you raise an interesting question since we're going to be talking about organization space, and that's attractive to many of our listeners. What is an organization? I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, and I think, as I may have said in some of our preliminary conversations, Michael, I was dissatisfied with what the answers were in the classical literature, which I read a good deal about. I think, an answer was they are either mechanical systems. This is sort of well known, Katz and Kahn and others that regard as input-output systems, flagrantly open systems that are throughputs. And then you would get some notions that they are, spiritual entities or somehow metaphysically driven by purpose and so on, all which are fine, or strictly humanistic systems or sets of relationships, but they didn't go far enough as matters of practice for me. I was working in a statewide commercial bank in California, and that organization was awfully stuck. And so that started to back me up. I started to back up, as it were, in what is an organization at its roots, and how, for thinking about it, because if we didn't really understand that, how would we intervene when they are terribly stuck to improve them? I mean, we would have less fortune in intervening to do it because we weren't dealing with what's actually inside the organization and animating it. And it seems to me organizations are not, and there were other answers in the classical literature, like Gareth Morgan's Images of Organizations and so on, where he dealt with all these things as metaphors and images. But it's like, it struck me, no, organizations are real work systems, even those that and they're made up of, in the human realm, of human animals. So a social system is not something that comes down from the clouds, separate from humanity. It is a function of what being a human being is in our sociality. And that's where I found Reich's understanding of emotional energy, and that he learned as a student of Freud, and how people come together to perform a function that is natural to the way the organization is constituted. In other words, organizations are conceived and born, and they are born to fulfill some function. Like a bank could be to help mediate the flow of commerce, and it could be more specific than that for particular kinds of banks, like merchant banks versus a retail bank, or a hospital is conceived and constituted to perform community medical services. So there is a function that it needs to perform. And if it doesn't, that organization is going to get in trouble. Its work won't be fulfilled, and the people won't feel fulfilled. And what Reich did for me is help understand there's an energy streaming in the system that is in the human animal. They come together to do some common things based on what the system is constituted to do. And there's emotional energy associated with it. Like when founders found an organization, there's almost always excitement. That was sort of missing in the classical formulations, the emotional energy of the excitement. And Reich helped understand that. And I'll just add, and even major thinkers like Ed Schein, I had personal correspondence with him on this, and others, they don't understand there's an emotional energy streaming in the system. They think that the human animal is separate. The dialogical OD people think this too, that it's separate from nature. It's a social system, not a biosocial system. And we know all animals work. Ants work in colonies. That's a social construction of what they do. Birds fly in formation when they're migrating, when they're pursuing a migratory function. So primates forage in troops. Wolves travel in packs. They're all performing social functions. So the human animal is different as a species, but it's not cut off from nature. All the theory cut us off from nature, and they did not understand we are performing natural functions. So there's lots of piecemeal things that are done when it comes time to intervening, and there's not an understanding how the energy for work gets turned back into the system and fuels dysfunction, both socially or behaviorally, cognitively, and structurally in the system. And that was sort of, I'm giving you a long-winded answer, but I wanted to get it in here, Mike.
No, it's fine.
And that's sort of how I see, and I see an organization as a mini social system. It is not an animal. It is not an animal, but it is a natural unitary energy system where the participants, the human animals, converge together to perform some function that is social in nature. And that's a real thing. When that work gets stymied because of developmental processes that we understand well in some classical organization development terms, sociodynamics and Tuckman and all the rest, that understood there are stages. If that doesn't get fulfilled properly, the organization will remain compromised in its function. But it's not simply social psychological. It's an active energy that stays trapped in the system in certain characteristic way, hence the title, out of the workforce, out of the workplace trap. The system is trapped, and the spontaneous energy that wants to move towards its natural function doesn't get performed. I almost heard nothing of that in the literature, and I found those were gaps that resulted in practice dilemmas that were common.
And in many ways, I mean, this is an exploration, at least an initial exploration of Reich's ideas around energy systems. And why don't you say a little bit about who he was and, what it meant to you, I mean, to connect with that work?
All right, that's a very fair question. Not so many people know of Reich today. He has to some extent been written out of the history of psychiatry, clinical psychiatry, and natural science. His findings were quite controversial at the time. Reich was born at the very end of the 19th century, and he was a student of Freud's, close to Freud, second generation analyst. And Freud, I'll say just a word about this, thought so much of Reich about what he was doing, conceptually how he was sound, and as a practitioner, a psychoanalytic practitioner, that he put him in charge of the Vienna training seminar of technique, where he was teaching. He was 27 at the time. Reich was curing patients, and he was advancing the theory of psychoanalytic practice at the time, where people had entrenched difficulties. So he was a natural for me to want to look at to some extent, and I wonder if there's something comparable or when we're dealing with very stuck organizations. When one is dealing with sort of moderate problems of facilitation or let's adjust this or that, all of the traditional techniques are just fine. You don't have to focus so much on mobilizing energy, although I think we are doing that. So to get back to Reich for a moment, so here he was, 27, doing that. Let me say just a moment about Freud. Reich thought greatly of Freud's initial work. This goes back to the 1890s now, with Freud's own teacher, a guy by the name of Joseph Breuer, that said, look, what gets stuck in a person, in an individual, you're not talking social systems, they're talking in an individual, when they were treating what were obviously neurotics, they didn't want to just dismiss them as sort of morally or unfit or something. They wanted to see if they could understand what the basis of it was. Breuer's notion was, look, if the smoke gets caught in the house and can't get out, it will remain trapped. It'd come out in other ways, the smoke. So that became something that they called, and Freud later identified, with sexual energy, libido, that if that gets dammed up because of social repression or however, it will come out in dysfunctional way. The energy is what innervates the problems, the dysfunction, either psychically or somatically. And Reich was one of the very few that really built on that. The rest of the Freudian fold, and even Freud himself and his daughter Anna Freud, they moved into what was called ego psychology. So it became social psychology. They did not understand there was an emotional energy. Now, I will say the one thing that Freud did understand, and Breuer, they said just recalling memory is not going to be enough. The cognitive association, or making the unconscious conscious, did not cure. What they realized, you can go back and look at this in their original essays. Fortunately, all this stuff is in the history if one cares to read it, is the memory, the recovery of the memory had to be associated with what they called an abreaction, or a deep feeling of the feeling. If that wasn't there, there was no emotional catharsis or release of the energy. It stayed in the system, what they call the actual neurosis, innervating the psychoneurosis. And I see the similarity on that in organizations is that's what people attend to, the psychoneurosis, the culture, the social psychology, the behaviors, the cognitive behaviors, but very few are systematically dealing with how the emotional energy folds on itself. They may deal with some of the symptoms of emotion, of the emotions or the feelings, But those feelings this became clear to me as I read more of Reich, that the emotional energies congeal around a function that is natural for how that organization is constituted historically. Now, Reich went on, he became quite controversial because he studied social science. He was the first guy to integrate Marx and Freud. That was a little much for the grand old man. And then he moved quickly into dealing somatically. He's the granddaddy of somatic therapy. And he went into the laboratory because there was phenomena he was observing of how emotional energy was held, concentrated, and released. And he wondered, was it bioelectric energy? He just didn't go to some notion he made up. He ran experiments. He was clever. He was also trained by the first Nobel laureate in neurobiology. So Reich early on, and at first he thought it was a bioelectrical energy, and he ran experiments, and it didn't conform to the properties of what bioelectricity was. So he postulated some other things. He went into the laboratory using pretty state-of-the-art, very state-of-the-art technique at the time, looking at single like amoebas, single simple organisms, to see whether there is emotional energy that displayed there, and some of it wasn't following what was known in classical science. It violated. Now that was quite controversial. He did this. He was an Austrian-Hungarian, and then this was all prior to Hitler coming to power. Then he moved to Oslo or Berlin, and then Oslo, and then the United States. But what Reich then began to do after that, and then he ran physical experiments, not just biological experiments, but in physics, using not biological, where he was looking at, is there energy phenomena, not with life forms, and he was again finding some astounding things, that the experiments were, and some astounding anomalies, one of which Einstein confirmed and never fully accounted for. There's a history to that. I cover that in my book. But it was very controversial because it overturned a lot of classical notions, or it had the implications for doing that. One thing, and then I'll finish on Reich. The one thing that Reich did is that he thought very critically and specifically and empirically about what is a natural energy system. They're not all living systems. Those are biological systems, and they have membranes. Well, organizations don't have membranes. They have boundaries, but they're far more, and we know this in the classical literature too, they're fluid. They move in and out. People work at multiple jobs. Even what we call organs in a social system, in an organization, they don't have membranes. Living systems have membranes. They don't. They're more pliable, but they can develop rigid structures that inhibit the circulatory flow of the energy, the emotional energy that's grounded towards doing work, and then it doesn't concentrate properly, and it doesn't flow or discharge. And that's in the language. We talk about discharge of tasks and so on. Are you charged up in your work when there's lack of? I mean, Mike, as a long practitioner, when you see people not charged up about work, it's hard. And we even use the same language, some of the same language. The work is uninspiring and so on. So Reich had lots to say about, although he didn't speak about organizations. After a lot of study, I have concluded that organizations are an intermediate class of a natural energy system. A completely non-living, non-energy system might be like a weather system. There's no animal, there's no organism there, but it's how the energy concentrates, and it forms certain patterned movements, or galactic systems, for example. But in a biological system, whether it's a simple single cellular kind of organism like an amoeba, or they're made up of a few minor cells, smaller cells, or a human being, that's an animal. And they're all discharging work in the way they perform. In the human animal, because of our evolutionary status, we have a very large neurobiological and kind of plastic component, but not everything goes. The energy is still streaming on us. We're not cut off in the natural world. And it seemed to me our thinking needed to be deep enough and inclusive enough to really account for that, or in very troubled cases, we're not going to quite know what we're going to miss the mark when we intervene, because we have to somehow deal with how that energy gets immobilized in the system.
It's great. No, it's great, Marty. I mean, appreciate that. So we've talked, we've described, what is organization, which I think nicely flowed into the work that you just described with Reich. And now what I'd like to do is, for many of our listeners, is what's the tie then back to organization development? Because I think you begin then to relate all of this to, Burke or Shine or Schoen or Lewin or
That's
Trist
right.
or
That's right.
So can you talk about that, this relationship, how that came about?
Yes, and they're all very fine thinkers as far as they go. I mean, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants here in terms of their work and in terms of it. So organizations represented an intermediate class, not purely a non-living system, but it is a non-living system made up because there's no boundary, there's no membrane to encapsulate it, but it did have flows, and so it consisted. Its animating energy consisted of the streaming together of individual human animals. That's what makes an organization alive. It's not the machines or the computers or AI or anything else. I mean, this will go quite far if one takes it out. Now, organizational systems do have mechanical components, processing equipment, all the rest. And they have a kind of rhythm in the way they move. We speak of a tempo in an organization and so forth. Some network organizations will tend to be more fluid, and they still will have an integrity in the way they operate, socially and structurally. So in intervening, then you have to look, well, where does the energy get stuck? And how does it get stuck? I found there were characteristic ways the organization got stuck. And if one looks at thinkers like the classic psychoanalytic thinkers that worked in organizations, Katz de Vries, Larry Hirschhorn, others, Levinson, I mean, there are others, what they tended, because this is where the psychoanalysts stop, the mainspring was anxiety. The whole organization, as it's applied to organizations, consists of trying to tamp down anxiety or irrational impulses or fantasies, anxiety. Reich helps us understand, no, there's a spontaneous emotional energy that's exciting at the root of a system. We know that when organizations are founded. They're excited when founders come together, and the atmosphere, we even say, is charged around it. And thinkers like Carl Weick and others got this, but they did not quite get the natural energetic excitement. And so if you think of an organization instead as a machine, you're going to try to engineer your way out of the problems. And that's unfortunately where socio-technical systems theory, as much as Trist did fundamental work that was deeper than that, it got stuck in checklists of behaviors and so forth on the social side. It did not understand these are people streaming together, and when the work doesn't stream together properly, you're going to have dysfunction. And that's where you have to attend to. And it's going to get manifested. The other thing that I learned from Reich was thinking about this as a special class of energy system, like the human organism in that respect. There is a structure that is a natural structure, what Barry Oshry called tops, middles, bottoms. Oshry well understands it, but he considers it sort of politics, not a streaming energy that gets stuck in the system. And great thinkers like Henry Mintzberg, he understood it. Strategic apex, the head of the organization, the middle line, the operating core. And that they all understood there are flows and systemic flows, but seeing that the energy can get stuck there in characteristic different ways. Like if you have an organization operating like a machine, kind of equivalent to a compulsive character, the very spontaneity is going to be stuffed out in the organization. And they're going to have characteristic chronic problems with innovation, for example, because the fear of spontaneous movement is a core problem. And you can't behaviorally train that out of existence. That's in the system. The energy has to be remobilized and resculpted by the way the interventionist intervenes. And that will affect itself in the way that energy is top, middle, and bottom. So, for example, in a compulsive-like organization, the top will tend to lose perspective, be very enmeshed in details, process analytics, analysis by paralysis, but they will tend not to see the big picture of how they're getting stuck because there's fear behind it. And until you deal with the emotional energy and the fear, which means you can't train it by giving them and this is where a lot of OD stops. Unfortunately, it stops. Well, teach them the right behaviors so they're not afraid. And that's supposed to be modern. It's like they actually, until they feel their fear, they're going to be stuck because that's what's holding them in abeyance. And they've got to get that. And you have to come upon that gradually as a change person in a way that's effective, using the language that they understand. You don't talk to them about organization therapy. You talk to them about how you're going to help them get moving together, together, and not be as stuck. And so that's sort of how, anyway, is that enough of an application?
Yes, that's great.
And there are character types, I'll just add for a moment, that are different than a compulsive type. The energy gets stuck in a different way. Like there are some systems that are very aggressive. After they get constituted, they never have a chance to go through their developmental paces where they develop adequate infrastructure and processes. And so they're always pushing product out the door, and the quality of the product gets subordinated, and getting bigger and bigger and bigger becomes the characteristic presenting symptom. And that's what we have to work with. How do we roll that back and get them in tune with what's holding them back? That's the way the emotional energy gets blocked. That goes very far in what founders do, all kinds of stuff. All right.
Wonderful. And I was wondering about that in relationship to democracy. Maybe it's one of the parts of the stage theory that you identify, but you write a lot about democracy in this book and the relationship to democracy, which I think so many of the, last century and maybe even the century before that organization development thinkers, well, certainly the last century thinkers had on their minds.
That's right.
How do you see that today?
Well, and Lewin certainly did. They dealt with
because the reason I'm asking that is because I think most organizations, it's antithetical to think about democracy in most corporate organizations.
Well, it sort of depends, and one has to go below the surface of what just the espoused values are. So, for example, if one goes into the history of the Disney company, I talk about this. Disney ran a very collaborative enterprise. He let people who were better than him, like he knew he couldn't draw as well as Ub Iwerks. Ub, you draw Mickey Mouse. I have an idea about it. But he had a particular burning view of what he wanted that business to be. And he hired people who were better than him. His brother was much better in finance and administration than him. Disney, and so there was great collaboration in the way they worked and invented new aspects of that business. The way they moved in from animated shorts. First they were just shorts to full feature animation and then the theme parks. They were very collaborative enterprises. And Disney himself was a rather rock-ribbed Republican and very, very, very anti-union. And there's interesting history and ironies that occur. But that was a rather work democratic system in how it sort of naturally functioned. And when it got off course, it had to correct itself. And it did. That business has been thriving for many, many years. 60 years after the old man's death.
How do we encourage participation in organizations then?
Well, I think I would, turn the question back to you in the way that you do. How do you, I must say, this isn't sort of unique to me, but I was always astounded when people say, how do we engage people in an organization? You get them together and ask them what they think about a problem that matters to them, or an opportunity that matters to them. You don't need a lot of fancy dancy programs that you have score. And one might do that, but that's not the essence of how you engage people. You pull them in so their energies move together, concentrate together, and then can be discharged. Now, if you do that and you do nothing about it as a corporate entity or at the head of the organization, the energy remains trapped in the organization and you frustrate the people. Look, that's famous. Mike, you know that, right? how many attitude surveys get done year after year after year? It's the same thing that gets reported and nothing happens. That's pretty usual.
Yeah, I think the greatest technology is to say hello.
Well, it's you show up with your humanity. You show up with your personhood. Yeah.
Yeah, Marty, as we think about this and if our listeners wanted to know, what will I gain by reading this wonderful book recently out, I think April, out of the Workplace Trap, a theory and therapy of organizations based on the work of Wilhelm Reich. What's the call to action here for readers?
I think it's particularly suited for practitioners that have been vexed by working with systems, and the systems don't seem to be able to move. They're stuck. And they may try the various methodologies, sociotech, appreciative inquiry, dialogical OD, I mean, all the modern ones and all the classical ones. And somehow the systems remain stuck, and they want more knowledge of where and when and in what sequence to intervene, and a clear understanding of what is stuck in the system and what do we need to let go of, what do we not need to do, because the energies can move and will remobilize on their own if we get the blocks out of the way. But it's understanding what fails to concentrate naturally and not. And that will mean, people might have to give up certain ideas in their head that they have, this is only this that we're seeing. This is a value problem. Or this. It's like, no, stay committed to the best of what Schein and Lewin taught, for example, was to just observe what is going on in the system. Get yourself immersed in what you're seeing and allow the ideas to come out of that. Don't simply lead with your ideas. It doesn't mean you won't have hunches. Of course you will. You can't help but have them. You're human. But you try to engage, and so it's an inductive process where you can observe, this is what the organization seems to do. I mean, I did my first work even in this theory without the theoretical framework that I developed. I developed it out of the experience. It's like, here's a system that no matter where we look, it always seems to be biting off more than it can chew. How do I slow them? So that led me to the OD strategy of how do I slow them down where they can see that and then deal with whatever their anxiety is, and I maybe wouldn't call it anxiety, whatever it is that made them rush to do that and not sit still long enough to concentrate. And I would use classical techniques to do that, of course, visioning exercises and so on. But you have some systems that won't sit still for a visioning exercise. They'll blow you. I mean, I worked with a system like that. They'll blow you away if you tell them we need to do a visioning exercise. And yet, they don't see things clearly. So how do you mobilize them through task interventions that get them collectively seeing more clearly? That's the problem. It's not. So that's what they're going to get, I think, more than here's an array of techniques, because there are plenty of fine techniques. I mean, you could, but a grab bag of liberating structures, in my opinion, isn't going to get you there. You have to know how to put them together and for what functions you're trying to unpack. Yeah.
And do you think all of this is more or less complicated when we have less physical contact with each other, where we smell less of each other?
That's a very good question. It is complicating. I do have a chapter that deals with the realities of network organizations, and then a final chapter that deals with the larger implications for macro social systems, politics and intervention. What are rational interventions into social systems so they're renewed, so workplaces in aggregate are more fulfilled, but I mean, as a social matter more broadly than just an individual system or a couple systems. But I think to answer your question, it gets more complicated. In some ways, the more networked we are, the less emotionally present we are with people, and there's actually more emotional distance, or more the technical language that's used in Reich's work and in Gestalt therapy was sort of derivative of Reich in some ways. Fritz Perls was a student of Reich. Reich was his clinical supervisor. Was emotional contact is less, And the split between perception and what people sense and feel is more pronounced. So it becomes sort of free-floating perceptions that are cut off from the roots. And I think it goes quite far of how people can get quite far afield. And organizational systems can get like that. That leads to emotional resignation in systems, all kinds of stuff. And then that's then called, as a syndrome, the Great Resignation or quiet quitting or so on. But these are all functions of the way people they give up because the emotional energy, retreats into the system. In some classical psychology understands this about moving out and withdrawal. They understand that, but Reich understands the pulsation is natural in the rhythmic movement of a system. Even non-living systems like hurricanes, they move in a certain rhythm. Now, they will gather in a way, they gather the energies in a way where they'll become destructive and ferocious at a certain time. So how do we understand that in systems? People will get that, and I think it will help in this modern, postmodern world, post-information world. I think that it's all not going to get banished with just data and analytics. That's not going to do away with the primal animating energy. It just won't. I just don't think it will. I never experienced that in a system. It's like the system is stuck. I can't just have these notions in my head about mechanical systems and I have to re-engineer this or be reductionist and say it's molecular collisions. What are you going to do with that as an interventionist? Like nothing. And I thought a lot of culture analysis, it was all interesting when I read it, and I thought true, but it didn't deal with an animating energy that it was binding or driving it in the first place. So I didn't find there was that much I could do with it for systems that were in trouble. It's like what am I going to sit there and show them a model or show them a singy feedback cycle? All correct intellectually, but as far as they go. But the people I knew in organizations, it's like, look, we got real problems here. We're hurting. We're hemorrhaging inside. People are quitting. We can't get product out the door. They're stuck.
It's been a great discussion, Marty. Really appreciate it. And I know that we've just scratched the surface. And tell people where they can find Out of the Workplace Trap, a theory and therapy of organizations based on the work of Wilhelm Reich.
I will. And I want to thank you, Mike, before I do that, for just opening the door for me to be as thorough as I did and letting me sort of say it. Reich was very controversial because of these findings, so one won't find much of him. I do have in the book things that I think his work has all been republished in the original, and I have a thing at the back of the book for further reading on Reich that I think are reliable things to read. Okay, both modern and his original work. Okay, so you can get me, I think at my Gmail is the best way to do that, is MDG, distant drummer, DISTANT drummer @gmail.com. And you can find the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or bookshop.org, and it'll get to you, and call me. I'm on LinkedIn. That's a very fine, Martin Goldberg. It's an easy way to reach me. I teach a clinical seminar for mostly practitioners, been at it for a time. That's a 9-month seminar, goes once a month for 4 hours on a Saturday. It's virtual. And I teach the theory and method of the book. The book is text for that. So people that really want to go deep and go beyond simply reading the book. And you could see a few things about that on my LinkedIn site. That's sort of the best way to get a hold of me. And I'll give you my phone number if you want it. It's 703-599-7000 in the U.S.
Well, that's great. And just put a +1 in front of it if you're calling from other places.
That's
wonderful to be in conversation today with Martin Goldberg, a leader in the field of organization development and author of the book that we've discussed during this podcast on Wilhelm Reich and its application to organization development and systems thinking generally. So again, thank you so much, Marty. And again, until the next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horn, stay well.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change Podcast.